Welcome everybody. My name is Ed Price. Hello. Yeah, please feel free to type in the IM. Ask any questions that you have. We'll answer questions as we go. I'm Ed Price, Azure CAT Customer Advisory Team. So I help run programs and feedback programs on Azure development scenarios. If you are not in Azure Advisors, which means that you're not part of our Service Fabric Advisors, but you'd like to be, I'd like to welcome you to join us. I'm going to put something in the IM window here. This is a link. If your company is not in Azure Advisors, if you're not in Service Fabric Advisors, to give us feedback, get on previews, and basically to help us make your future tools better and to meet your needs. If you're not part of that, then we want you to join us. So you can click that link to get your company involved. So welcome everybody, and why don't we go ahead and get started. If you have any questions, go ahead and post them. Otherwise, we'll have some of our team members start with some basic overview topics.
Yeah, maybe it would be a good idea just to introduce a couple of people from the team. So my name's Mark Fussell, and I work on the Service Fabric team.
Sean McKenna. I also work on Service Fabric and other parts of Azure Compute focused on developer experience.
I am Manir Swami. I'm also a part of the Service Fabric team, focusing on this Linux preview.
Yeah, so we're pretty excited about, we released Service Fabric as the service inside Azure at the end of March at the Build conference. And since then, we've been seeing lots of people post questions on various different forums like Stack Overflow and on the MSDN forum. And actually also on the Discuss feedback that you get on the actual documentation, there's been a lot of questions there. So we thought it'd be a great opportunity to sort of open it up to everyone to kind of just ask questions, both from roadmap perspective about where we think Service Fabric is going, to specific questions you might have on some particular issue that you're having. So we'll do our best to address all of these, and if we don't get the actual details to you today, we're more than happy to follow up on specific details by directly contacting us. We can put our some of our contact details on there, or best place to ask these questions is on Stack Overflow on the MSDN forum, because we monitor those daily. So, if we'd like to start with some roadmap direction, I can talk a little bit about that, or maybe there's some burning question that people would like to throw into the IM window, and we can just take it from there.
Why don't we start with the roadmap while people are getting warmed up?
Okay, so where we are at the moment is that we have a service that we released in Azure, where you can go up and create a cluster and host your applications running in Azure. We also released at Build at the same time what we call a Windows Server standalone preview, where you can take Service Fabric and install it on a set of Windows Server machines. So you can literally physically just take some boxes, network them together, and by running a PowerShell command, install a Service Fabric cluster on there. So that gives you the power and the capabilities of running your own on-premise hardware and installing Service Fabric there. As we look towards the on-premise story going forward, you'll see Service Fabric, you'll see a GA of that later in this year. We're looking towards about Q3 of this year to sort of GA the on-premise standalone version. And then Service Fabric will also be included as part of Azure Stack, which is our ARM-based Azure representation of on-premise that builds on top of Windows Server, along with other Azure resources you get inside there, like storage and compute and network. And so you'll see the full ARM capabilities of Azure on-premise offering there that you can install. And then at Build, we also announced at least a limited preview of an ability to kind of sign up to a preview program. And there's many ways that we ran a preview program for Windows, but from our Linux side. If you're interested in that, we're more than happy to welcome you into that program. And a public preview of that will be much later this year, as we sort of gain experience with that and get some feedback on that program. So that's kind of the roadmap of how we look at things. And of course, what we also intend to do is you'll see regular drops and updates from the Service Fabric SDK. We're going to be dropping a new update, which will be what we refer to as the runtime as our 5.1 release, or next to 2.1
SDK.
1 SDK. And we'll tend to do those every 2 months. You'll see a new drop of an SDK with new features in it, which we'll announce inside the release notes. And we can talk about a few of those today about what would be coming in that. And, that's what you'll see in terms of a regular cadence for new features that get rolled out, both into the clusters that you have hosted, and then there's an SDK to build against new features inside that. So let's kind of dive in here and see if there have been a few questions yet.
Yeah, so I think Manny covered Sean's question on documentation. If there are issues that you're seeing with the docs, please go ahead and add comments there. Actually, I'm curious whether the discrepancies you're talking about are in the conceptual documentation, so what you find on Azure.com, or if it's more with the API, PowerShell, REST documentation that's on MSDN. Okay, yeah. So it's not quite as straightforward to add comments on the MSDN docs. In fact, I'm not sure that there is a way at all. So what I would recommend there is we opened up a GitHub repo for you to report issues. So if you want to go ahead and just add bugs that you're finding in the MSDN docs over on that GitHub repo, we'll take a look at those there. We do know that our API documentation is a little bit behind, or not up to the same quality as we would like, and not up to the same quality as the conceptual documentation. So that's something that we're focused on bringing up to that same quality bar. So go ahead and add issues to the GitHub repo, and we'll get them fixed up. I think there was a question on timeline for regional rollout, specifically North Europe. If you go up.
North Europe. Yeah, North Europe. So what you'll see is that we're rolling out Service Fabric across all the regions on a schedule. Many of our regions, several regions will be coming online in May. North Europe particularly is a more challenging one, actually. So in Europe, there are 2 data centers. North Europe is based in Dublin. You're not going to see that one until later this year. And what I mean by that is it's going to be in the Q4 of this year, so in the last 3 months of this year. And a lot of that's got to do with the fact that we're having just to find some particular capacity inside that region in order to get there. So that's one that's later on our schedule at this point in time. You'll see coming online in May Central US 2 and other ones inside the US region, India, and also, actually I can't remember the top of the details of my schedule off the top of my head, but I can think about trying to share some details of that in some way if that's important.
Yeah, I think we should probably follow up with a blog post on kind of where we are in terms of regional rollout and kind of what
that makes sense. I think it would be good to at least kind of pinpoint it within, the month or kind of within a couple of months of whatever it all looks like.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Integration between Service Fabric and App Insights. Yes, there is work happening there. Actually, it's interesting. The Application Insights team, after the build announcement, did some analysis on Google search traffic and saw that Service Fabric had rocketed up in terms of interest, and so all of a sudden they became much more interested. So they're now looking at integrating Service Fabric as kind of a first-class experience within App Insights. We don't have any timelines to share on that yet, but there is active work happening there.
The question on how do you plan... Sorry, keep going.
Go ahead, Mark.
No, you go.
Just say, okay, there was a question on a built-in pub subsystem, so I just put in a link there. So we don't have immediate plans to do it, but the primitives are there. So I just linked to the example built by a member in the Azure Cat team.
Yes, in fact, we posted a community blog post last week that pointed to Paolo Salvatore's PubSub example that he built with one of the customers that was in our preview program that they then put into production. And so he took that code and posted it up there. We don't have a direct plan for this at the moment, partly because we're having conversations with the Event Hub team. And the Event Hub team, they're kind of closer to the messaging side of requirements of what we're doing. So we're talking to them about what is it that they're doing from a PubSub perspective. And they're actually thinking about this more broadly across Azure. So I can't really share the details myself because I'd want to talk to their side of things, but it's more of a conversation we're having with the Event Hub team about what they're bringing functionality. So at the moment, we're just publishing sample code around how you can incorporate that into your solutions that you use with Service Fabric. Let's scroll down here.
So there was a question about deploy anywhere. So first of all, we're not using that term anymore. We're now referring to it as the standalone installer or standalone package. So please update your terminology accordingly. But there is going to be an update for that package coming fairly soon, I think, right?
Well, next week, yeah, we're going to publish an update for that as well as we do our rollout.
Yeah. So that'll be the 5.1 based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to be clear here, there seems to be a question of, is there a separate installer for a Windows Server that's different from Azure Stack? And the answer is yes. The standalone installer for Windows Server, as we call it, just works on Windows Server. That's all you need. You just take a set of machines with Windows Server, that's 2012 R2 and above. You run a single PowerShell script on one of those machines that copies Service Fabric onto the other machines inside the cluster. You have to, of course, describe the IP addresses of the machines in a JSON cluster manifest that you've configured beforehand. And then say you've got 5 machines, that PowerShell command copies Service Fabric to each one of those machines, configures each one of those, and basically joins them all into a cluster for you. And that's different from Azure Stack, where Azure Stack adds more on top of all of that. Azure Stack adds the ARM model across all of the other resources you get in Azure. So you get Azure Storage, Azure Compute, Azure Networking. You'll get Service Fabric inside there as well. And of course, coming with the ARM model is the consistency where, when you deploy things through an ARM model described in Azure, you can do the same on Azure Stack. So think of it as when you get Azure Stack, you get a greater, richer offering because you have the ARM model, you have the portal experience, everything like that. With the standalone Windows Server, that just allows you just to take raw Windows Server VMs just for Service Fabric.
And there was also, I think, along the same line, there was a question on when will it be possible to host Service Fabric on-prem with GoLive license. So we don't have an exact date yet. It's probably sometime this year, but we don't have an exact date yet. We're basically trying to figure out or clean up a bunch of end-to-end scenarios. So, for example, how to upgrade your cluster automatically, those kinds of things. So that's essentially the reason for the delay.
It's probably worth pointing out for anyone that was in the preview program for the Azure service and the SDK, you know that going from the preview releases to the GA release was fairly painful due to a set of breaking changes. The runtime bits in the SDK are common across, like you use the same SDK to target the on-prem version of Service Fabric. So even though that standalone installer is currently in preview, you shouldn't anticipate that there's going to be massive changes to move forward to GA. Really, all we're sort of iterating on the standalone side is the setup experience, and so that's going to continue to improve. But you can build the same applications to target clusters that are running on-prem.
So there's a question here from Matthew about hybrid clusters and what that means. So effectively, you can build a Service Fabric cluster anywhere where there's network connectivity. We actually haven't tried this for a while, but effectively, if you take Windows Server machines and you connect them up to from on-premise through to the cloud. It's technically possible. The challenge we have a little bit at the moment is that the JSON model and everything that we're doing for on-premise isn't exactly the same as ARM, because it can't be, because it's not ARM. So we're trying to make sure that we're looking at how do we make sure that technically it's completely possible for you to be able to create hybrid clusters. There's no reason between it. You can imagine you create a VPN between on-premise and on Azure, and the cluster joins. We've just got to make sure that the scenario of the fact that you describe your on-premise cluster and the manifest there matches with the JSON manifest we have inside ARM. So we're looking into that. At the moment, we haven't actually tried that scenario out, so I can't really say it's a supported scenario in any way. What we see a lot of people do, though, is that they tend to install something on-premise, and they have a cluster in Azure and they have a cluster on-premise, and they can install the same application across them. So, yes, Tommy messages.
Going to take the service bus, incorporating service bus topics.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with the fact that service bus topics would be a great feature to be able to put into Service Fabric. We just don't have anything on our roadmap to have the pub sub side of things as a service that gets deployed. What the direction is here, I guess, would be, and this is where I can only talk to some of the direction of this, but I mean, Service Bus and Event Hub are being looked at as features that we deliver into Azure Stack, and because it's one of the most common asked features inside there when people build applications, and of course both Service Bus and Event Hubs themselves are actually built on top of Service Fabric. They also use some underlying Azure storage as well. So I mean, really the question comes is that the only real direction at the moment is when you get Azure Stack, as it was GA, there will be this sort of on-premise offering that will include Service Fabric, Service Bus, and Event Hubs as a complete offering inside there. That's the only thing I can really talk about as a direction we'll end up there at the moment. Outside of that, there isn't any intention to incorporate Service Bus topics as part of Service Fabric.
So I think he had a follow-up later, which is potentially using Service Bus to bridge the gap as in terms of not having the pub sub model, I presume.
There is a great example. I mean, maybe one way of looking at this is that I find this community post, but there was someone who published a Service Bus Event Hub list. A Service Bus communication listener. So when you create a Service Fabric application, you can plug in any transport protocol or communication mechanism to that. And someone did publish on a GitHub account a Service Bus listener that allows you to communicate directly with services over Service Bus. So maybe that helps answer the question.
So the question on ASP.NET Core, we heard that RC2 shipped. So we do actually have a template that'll be in the SDK that comes out hopefully next week that will bring back the same ASP.NET functionality that we had with the RC1 template as part of the preview, so enabling you to build a web application or web service based on ASP.NET Core and run it inside a Service Fabric application. So that'll be there in the next SDK refresh.
Yeah, that's going to be pretty exciting, having ASP.NET Core now as a latest version that you can deploy in Service Fabric clusters.
So then the question around remote debugging, there is actually a doc article that explains that. Let me see if I'll pull it up and paste it in the window. It's in the main debugging article. There's a section.
Right, for reliable service, are there plans for enabling cross-platform transactions and cross-transaction services? It's actually something that we actually have prototyped internally for a while, and I would say there are certainly that is definitely the direction that we want to go. So the scenario here is that I have service A and I have service B, and we started to build this piece of technology called Reliable Streams that allows you to start a transaction with service A and transact across data structures, running in two different services. And that's certainly a direction we're going to go. I think at this point in time, you'll see that. I'd love to hear the priorities around this thing. We actually do hear quite a lot of people talk about this thing, especially when they want to build, sort of workflow type applications. It's something that we've understood for a while as being important to the system, but I don't think you're going to see it for the next few months yet. Maybe later in this year we'll get around to completing that piece of technology, but mostly at the moment that's not the highest priority thing on our radar. So let's scroll back up here a moment. Where are we? That was that Reliable. There was here one about NuGet packages and App Insights.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, the App Insights team is looking at a first-class solution for Service Fabric. Don't have any specific timelines to share on that as yet, but once that happens, that'll be the new way of integrating App Insights. So at this point, there's no plans to update that package that we had been previously shipping as part of the preview.
And on your question about providing a migration path from Service Bus on-premise to the new one, I don't know the answer to that one either. We'll have to ask the Service Bus team on that.
So there's a question on any plan to have a tool that would allow to visualize or manipulate the data. So this is something we are talking about internally. So I don't have an answer yet, but this is something that we are looking at what we can do internally.
Yeah, the IASync enumerable, there's no immediate plans, although I've seen a couple people that have written their own wrappers and shared those on GitHub. So maybe that's something we can include in one of the community roundup posts. But at this point, there's no plans to include one in the SDK in the near term.
And Gary Burrell, I think are there any plans to allow increasing the number of partitions? I assume you mean dynamically resizing the number of partitions for a reliable collections. Yeah, so again, this is something we are talking about, seeing how we can do this, but as of now, we haven't seen a case where there's an immediate urgency for this. We generally recommend folks start with enough number of partitions that allows them to scale out as much as they expect demand to grow. So, this is not something that we consider immediately urgent.
It's also a really hard problem.
It's a very hard problem.
Yeah. It's when we say we're talking about it, we mean like Friday afternoons, people sit around a whiteboard and kind of noodle on it, but it's not something that's coming anytime soon. So don't hold your breath. Definitely follow the model that Manny's suggesting of creating a bunch of partitions up front.
Yes.
Yeah, that one we already covered. Actors enhancements. Anything specific that you're interested in?
That's a question to Ivan.
Actor query. So when you say actor query, I guess actually Damir's answering on Ivan's behalf. When you say actor query, what kind of queries are you talking about? Are you talking about querying the actor state itself, like your custom state? Query for state, yeah. So I assume you're talking about querying your custom state, like your actor has some property that you've added and you want to be able to query across those actors. No, there's no immediate plans to do that.
Yeah, man, we had introduced query on a per partition basis for the service where the actors were running.
Right, but that's just querying the system state for the actors, right? Whether the actors exist and
yes,
that sort of thing. I think what the query for state here is like my actor has some value that I've stored.
Yeah, generally what we see though is that there's a kind of a preferred pattern where people build a service that has a reliable dictionary inside it that has all of the state that you want to query across all your actors, or all references to those actors with enough metadata that you look at those, and then so you may have, say, 10,000 actors representing people, but you just want to be able to query across the names of the data inside of those, and that's like indexed inside a reliable dictionary, and then from there you can perform queries, and then they go off and pick up the individual actors themselves. But querying across tens of thousands of actors is a pretty costly thing to be able to do. And so we don't actually, at this point in time, we don't have any plans to do that. We end up kind of more designing patterns rather than trying to build that.
So there was a couple of questions around build and integration with BSTS. Yes, good news on this one. We are working on both. So we're doing on the build side, all of the necessary files to build an application, we're going to have integrated into a NuGet package that gets associated with the application project. So that'll enable you to do a build on a hosted BSTS build agent, or really any machine that has the kind of basic MS Build components on it. So you won't need to install the Service Fabric SDK to make that work. And then on the deployment side, we're looking at adding the necessary pieces in terms of the PowerShell commandlets to enable deployment from a hosted build agent, from a hosted BSTS build agent. So once those two things are done, then you'll be able to do everything on a hosted agent, not have to set up your own custom agents. So that'll be the NuGet package piece. Will be in the next SDK refresh coming next week, so that'll get you out of the build portion, and then we're just finalizing getting the SDK installed on the build agents to get the deployment piece.
In answering your question of I have compute agents generating gigabytes of data which be consumed by other agents, I mean, Service Fabric doesn't get in the way of how you communicate between your services. We provide some built-in communication mechanisms, WCF, Web API, and our own Fabric Transport. But if you have your own services and you want to figure out how you communicate with them, you can build all those transports yourself. So sharing that data is just making a particular service have whatever communication mechanism you want to communicate with it. Answering the question about like stateless workers implemented in Orleans, is that because you're saying I want to be able to have a stateless thing backed by Azure storage, and I write to that as opposed to dictionaries? I presume that's the question. If so, we're not doing that at the moment in time. We just say to you, take your actor, and we've had quite a few customers who take their actors, their stateless actors, and they've built their own write mechanism to write it back to Azure storage themselves. But at the moment, that's not on our plans. Listen, Boris, you've just burst in the door.
Yeah,
there's a container question at the same time. When are we going to support Windows containers?
So we are currently targeting the 2nd of June to provide bits that support Windows containers.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the container plans and what will happen with Service Fabric?
Yes, I can talk a little bit more. So in the first drop, what you get on, and again, it's like we are targeting 2nd of June. And as always with those type of things, you take that date with a grain of salt, but we right now feel kind of confident. So what you get there is you basically get a Service Fabric 5.1 drop that has like the container functionality in there. And in that build, you will be able to spin up containers from obviously container images that can live in Docker Hub, like the public registry. You can also pull them from a private registry. From a support regarding environment variables, we hope to get that in. You will definitely have a service registry and discovery support because we're using our own naming service. So what that means is if you have a service in your container listening at a certain port, you can define an endpoint in the service manifest and then map that endpoint through an endpoint policy, and then Service Fabric will assign a dynamic port to it. So by using the naming service, you basically have the capability just to query that service through or the service in the container through the naming service, and that will return the IP of the node and the endpoint for that container. So that's all planned for 6.2 on the Windows container side. I'm currently working on documentation and samples that should go out with that, or even like we can share it with that group even before.
Yeah, I mean, this is the release you're talking to is talking about our Windows Server standalone release.
Yes.
on premise, because that's the one that you can run on Windows Server 2016 on the TP5 release that they did.
Good point.
A couple of weeks ago.
We're also thinking about right now, but that's probably not going to land for 6.2, that we give you an ARM template that actually sets something like that up in Azure, that you can spin up a Windows Server 2016 Service Fabric or host with Service Fabric in Azure, but that may not come. Will be a single machine.
Okay.
We're thinking about that right now, but that might not make it.
Yeah, so in summary, there's going to be container support on the on-premise installation that we do, so you can.
Yes.
Yeah. It's good. Any plans to choose an existing VNet while deploying a cluster into the portal? I've heard this one quite a few times before, and I think it sort of makes sense at this point in time. No, you have to create a new VNet. I'd love to know the scenario you have. I presume is it because you have some existing resources and you just want to use that VNet? So I'd love to hear the scenario a little bit more that you're thinking of that requires you to use an existing VNet rather than build a new one. Then there's this one on currently you have to put PowerShell in order to create Key Vault, and a plan to integrate this into the portal. Yeah, we recognize at this point in time you have to kind of go off to another PowerShell tool to create these Key Vaults to put them in there. I think again this is in the realm of whether you're wanting to create a new Key Vault or whether you have an existing Key Vault that you're already trying to use. So we were just concerned around having people feel as if they had to create a brand new Key Vault when setting up a Service Fabric cluster when they have an existing one already, and then the difference between that. But we recognize that that's something that, you know, it's very important to build secure clusters, and making that a more seamless experience is certainly something that's on our radar. I think you may be able to see an improvement in that scenario generally as we look towards future releases. You're not going to see it in the next release, but we're improving the portal on every 2 weeks. We're doing some changes inside there. So, yes, it's good feedback. We hear this one a lot of making secure clusters more easily. I mean, one thing that we did do to make managing your cluster more easily is we've introduced Active Directory as a way that you can authenticate your users rather than having to use certs. So, in the 5.1 drop that you're getting next week, you'll be able to set up Active Directory and use that to authenticate from the Service Fabric Explorer or from or when you log on to the Azure portal, rather than having to use certs to do the authentication of that, which makes it much easier for you to generally manage the cluster operations that you do. Right, let's keep scrolling down here.
So regarding blogs, yes and yes. So we do have more plans to write more service fabric under the hood blog posts. And I think you just gave us another idea, so we'll put it in the list, how the naming service works internally.
Yeah, one thing that we're doing in our blog post is that we're getting more customer stories written there. You'll see some in the next couple of weeks from our preview program. You'll see 2 new customers published on there. That will just tell their story of what they've built over the last few months and help provide some design guidance and dive deep into what they did, a bit like we did with the TalkTalk one back in March.
And Juho and Tom, regarding setting up secure clusters, yes, we understand that there's a little bit of work on our part that we need to do to make it really easy. So one of our PMs is actually working on an end-to-end documentation that puts everything together. That should hopefully take a step towards making it easy for you to set up a secure cluster.
On the partitioning side for actors, there's nothing we actually have at this point in time to have control over how you do the partitioning. The IDs are still spread randomly across the set of partitions that you have.
I mean, the intent is that the actors are independent, and so there isn't functionality built in for you to tie them together. On the communication listeners, yes, we do intend to at least provide a package. So the WCF communication listeners included in a NuGet package already. And we intend to add an ASP.NET Core-based communication listener. So we think that one will be pretty popular. Those are kind of the main ones that we're looking at, including as sort of part of the official product at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the Service Bus ones and one for Event Hub are 2 very popular ones. There are a couple of examples in both samples we ship and in community GitHub accounts that we have. I think if they become more popular and we see those picked up, then they'll be interesting ones to add. But at the moment, we don't have any plans.
The other comment I'll make quickly on the secure cluster setup is that we are, or in fact, we have enabled Azure Active Directory for client authentication. So that's we're calling it in preview now. I think we're going to take the preview tag off as part of this next release. But if people haven't seen it, I can just add the documentation for how to do that in the IAM window, because it's all available today. We marked it as preview because we wanted to get a few more eyes on it before we called it sort of ready for production use. But that's a much easier way of doing securing the cluster than using client certs.
So going back to the adding it to a new VNet, yes, that makes sense that you already set up a new VNet with a partner and you won't be able to deploy a cluster into that. Let's take that, I'll take that one back to Chaco, who's the PM who does all of the Service Fabric portal and how we do all the provisioning of the cluster inside there, and talk about it with him. So yeah, that's great feedback. I think it's quite an interesting scenario that we probably haven't put enough time into thinking about. We tend to just thought that most people didn't have clusters already, but I understand that it does make sense that you have a VNet already. So, I mean, what you have to do today effectively is do this through ARM, is what you have to do, rather than through Portal. So, let me take it back to him and, get back to you, when we have the next community talk like this, we can give you some update on that. I think this question here is, are there any plans to create packages?
We already covered that. As communication listeners. Keep going.
Yeah, the HTTPS one, and what makes that really easy, we're actually writing an end-to-end how to set up a secure cluster through to how to get your cert, deploy it, manage the certs through the compute resource provider or through ARM, get them deployed into the cluster and use them to secure your app. And I think you're pretty well. We're going to try and get this published in the next couple of weeks, but that end-to-end walkthrough will be really useful to show how you make the cluster secure and the application secure. So I think you'll see a lot more improvements generally in the documentation for cluster security and actually application security as a whole, because we want to make that super easy for you to do.
Matthew's question, will the AD support handle organizations that only have AAD? Yeah, I mean, yes, it's really AAD support. It doesn't have anything to do with AD, on-prem AD. So yes, you can just set up an AAD directory and use that for your client auth.
Saying that, if you take the on-premise standalone installer, and we've still got to get around to putting the documentation on that, and you're running it in on-premise on your machines, that does allow you to do AD authentication actually that's different, sorry. That's not for the actual portal, not actually for the portal itself, but just for of how you run the app processes underneath AD accounts, Active Directory accounts.
Yeah, so Jean-Francois's question, this is a general issue that we're looking at, which is as you scale up to larger and larger applications, which is to say, not scale of sort of load in usage, but the size of the application in terms of services. How do you manage that within Visual Studio? We're looking at a model sort of similar to NuGet packages where the service could be packaged up and just referenced from within another project, so that if you're just working on one service project, you can pick up sort of a last known good version of other services to test against, so that you don't have to have all of the projects with all of their code in one Visual Studio solution. So that's definitely something that we're working on.
On the question around for stateful workloads such as database server, I'm just trying to maybe have to clarify the question a bit more here. Service Fabric, in terms of it, if you use its stateful compute, when you have failovers that happen across machines, or if the actual service gets used, the state is already copied and replicated onto another machine and fails over to the machine where you have copies for your state. If you're referring to, I've got in the Service Fabric terms, a stateless piece of code that's accessing some database, and then it fails over, it has to reconnect to the database. So, Service Fabric does provide stateful services that keeps the data with your code through replication, but it doesn't do that through bringing your own database. You have to take advantage of the reliable collections that we provide as part of all of that, as the replication failure, this replication technology for data. I think Boris did provide an example where you could wrap MongoDB, for example, and deploy that as a guest executable inside one of the samples. Did we provide that?
Yeah, that's like in the deploying multiple guest executables.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that you have to, I'm doing this is that as a guest executable, you could say deploying MongoDB, and it would fail over, but...
Yeah, but you need to be careful with the data storage, right? Because if you use like a database like MongoDB, like the way it is, and you store the data on disk and the node goes down and the data is not being replicated, because in that case, Service Fabric wouldn't do the replication, obviously, then your data is lost. So you probably want to put it in some external storage, like permanent storage. That's one option. The other option is that you, for those, especially MongoDB, another option would be that you use like a Mongo PaaS service, like Mongo Labs or something like that.
Yeah, so the project template, creating the test client, the reason that we took that out is that a lot of people were running into the issue where it worked locally, but it didn't work when they deployed it to Azure because the test client was using Actor Proxy and then relying on the naming service, which wasn't exposed through the load balancer, and so that was tripping people up. And typically, that's not a pattern that we expect people to use the proxy classes from clients running outside the cluster. So if you want to do that for testing, it's fairly simple to just create a test console application and use the proxy for local testing. But that's the reason why we took that out.
Yes, so the question is, any plans for open sourcing Service Fabric? Yes, we're going down this path. We're going to start by open sourcing the programming models first. So we're focusing on open sourcing the Actor and the Reliable Services programming models. This is kind of in conjunction the fact that, as we also move towards doing our Linux implementation as well, we realize that the open source community there, Linux community expects open sourcing of programming models or, bits of your framework. So that's where we're starting with today. So by the time we get to the end of this year, you'll see those programming models available for you. And we want to very much encourage people to look at those examples and not only just contribute to those programming models, but also help, build other frameworks and programming models on top of all this as well. So, we're also working on Java as a language binding. You'll see that included as well as part of the open sourcing for a language binding that we will do as well as the programming models that we provide. So yes, we're definitely going down that direction. It's going to take take a while though, because large parts of the system are written in C++, and we have other sort of build systems built in part of that. So we're having to break apart from our build system of how we do these things so that we actually get build systems that take advantage of open source GitHub accounts where we can push all this code. So there's kind of engineering systems behind all of this as well as just the programming models we have to do. But yes, we're getting there. We're going to go that direction.
So how do you build up the community posts? There's not too much of a process to it. I mean, we're basically monitoring Twitter and forums for things that are interesting, and then people share things that they've come across by email internally, and we just kind of take a look at all of that content and decide what we think is interesting to share with the rest of the community. If you find something that you'd like to share with us and think would be interesting for the rest of the community, probably the easiest way is to just link to it on Twitter and put the hashtag Azure Service Fabric, and we'll pick it up from there.
The integration with Power BI, well, I mean, the way we built our Service Fabric Explorer was that it all just called onto the REST APIs that we exposed. So everything gets exposed via REST. So one way that you can do and build your own portal or your own dashboards is to call onto those REST APIs yourself. But we don't have any plans to integrate that with Power BI today.
Guidelines on application security. We don't have anything, primarily because when you're talking about like application security for, say, the stateless web API front end, that's effectively just the same security patterns that you would implement for an ASP.NET front end. And so there isn't anything particularly specific to Service Fabric there. Really where we're focusing our energy on security is around securing the cluster management endpoint and setting up the cluster so that the necessary certificates, if you want to do HTTPS, are available on the VMs, so that you can serve those from there. So we aren't we're trying not to duplicate a bunch of existing documentation for things that you're just running inside of a Service Fabric environment if there isn't something specific to running in that environment.
Yeah, and we're saying that we do want to make it clearer around how you sort of do certificate management, which is done with Key Vault, and also how you can update and redeploy new certificates, because you can update the actual ARM template to pull down new certs onto the actual machines. So we will provide help and guidance on just kind of the best practice for doing that. But that's kind of using ARM generally outside of Service Fabric.
Any other questions?
Is it worth talking a little bit about 5.1 and anything else in there that we haven't touched on? That's the up-and-coming release that we do next week.
Obviously, the customers would want to hear that.
I know. I think we covered many things inside of it. I'm trying to think of the things we didn't cover.
Right. Manny, did you want to talk about the Linux preview at all?
Sure. I think I pasted a link a little earlier. So we do have a limited preview on Linux that's available, which basically is the Service Fabric runtime on Linux, and you can write applications using Java. And in order to sign up for the preview, let me just post the link again. So you sign up for the preview, and again, this is this is a preview. This is actually the first or second set of bits that we have actually released on Linux, even internally within Microsoft. So it's cutting edge bits, but if you can become part of the preview and take this for a test drive and give us feedback, we'd love to hear from you. And it's not just an opportunity for you to give us feedback. We are also developing this product, so you can actually influence its future directions by giving us feedback.
Yeah. So one thing to note on that is if you go to the link that Manny shared, you might see some language in there that sounds like, tell us about your scenario and your requirements. That's, if you have a specific scenario that you would love to use Service Fabric on Linux, that's great. We'd love to hear about it. But if you're also just the type of person that likes to kick the tires on new technology and try things out on the weekend and give us feedback, tell us what's broken, or be able to be on the cutting edge. There's no scenario required. Just an interest in trying things out and giving feedback is all that we're looking for.
Yeah. So if you looked at the survey and if you saw who had to answer 10 questions, you just have to answer the first question. We just need your email address so that we can onboard you. Everything else is optional.
So in terms of the next release, a couple of things that are coming in the tooling. We talked about the ASP.NET Core template coming back, the improvements we're doing around making it possible to do builds on a hosted VSTS agent. We'll be enabling an easier workflow for incorporating guest executables in your project. So today you have to just dump that into a specific folder within the project, and now we'll have a little bit of UI around that that should make things easier. Trying to think of what else. So AAD, we talked about being available in preview, and we'll sort of mark that as GA as part of this release. Kind of the big items on the tooling side.
Let me dig something up here a moment and help remind me.
Just as you're scrolling through that, I noticed the health metrics app. So a Probably about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, we posted a new sample. I know people are always looking for larger, more complex samples. So we posted a sample that we refer to as health metrics, which I can't remember off the top of my head what we called it in the actual sample gallery, but it's basically the basis of the demo that Scott Hanselman did at the VS Connect conference in November of last year when we announced the public preview of Service Fabric. So it incorporates a number of actor services, a number of reliable services, and has a nice UI on top of it, and you can use it to see a little bit of scaling capabilities, how services talk to each other, as well as an upgrade scenario. So I'll go ahead and pull that link up as well, because I know people are always looking for interesting samples to look at.
I mean, in terms of publicly.
Yeah. After Sean, so.
I'm just linking something.
Okay. So, folks, we also going to do something regarding readiness. So we put together a one-day training course, about Service Fabric, obviously, and it teaches you all the details about Service Fabric, how the packaging works, how application types relate to applications and all that type of stuff. So really more detailed hands-on training than what you have in the docs. We've taught that class now a couple times on site. Next week, we're going to go into the studios and we record the entire day. So think about an agenda as like Service Fabric platform capabilities, Service Fabric programming models, Service Fabric patterns, like patterns and practices. So this will be recorded and we'll make all the slides and demos available to you. So recording is scheduled for end of next week and it should go live probably mid-June.
Yeah, and that hopefully will be able to teach you a lot more about Service Fabric with details. You can just listen to videos.
Live where? It's going to be recorded on Microsoft Virtual Academy. So we'll share the link as soon as we have the public recording available.
Yeah. So in about a month's time.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you follow the blog and you follow the Azure Service Fabric Twitter hashtag, you should never miss anything that we do. Blog link, yes. And yeah, we'll get this recording posted up on the blog as well.
So I think that's about it. We're about out of time.
Thank you, everybody. Again, if you'd like to give us deeper feedback and get involved in engagements, please jump in on Service Fabric Advisors, and we'll talk to you later.
And we're going to hopefully hold these quite regularly, aren't we, Ed? Yes?
Yeah, we're planning monthly.
Oh, that's great. Okay, fantastic. See you in a month's time then.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.